Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this workshop on international relations in BP debating, understanding how the world works and applying it within this wonderful little hobby we have. My name is Alexander, and today I'm going to walk you through some of the core things that I think set international relations debates apart from kind of any other topic in BP debating. What we're going to go through today is firstly, I'm going to just walk you through an introduction of what this workshop is going to cover. Then, how do we learn stuff about international relations? How do we look at international relations? And then, what can you do within those debates? What are the things that you can think about and the ways that you break them down, and then apply them in order to win? This workshop is kind of an amalgamation of both my own experience within BP debating, what I've been taught through various workshops over the other years, and as well I've taken some things from workshops that other people have done online that I think have been particularly useful and bear repeating again and being more widely made known. So let's get into this. Firstly, there are, in my opinion, a finite number of motion topic areas where it can really matter to know stuff. And I do think that international relations, foreign policy debates, global politics debates are one of those areas. Why? Firstly, if you look at incentives, the characteristics of actors are a lot more key to this type of motion than any other debate. That is to say, you are likely to be debating actors who are taking a particular course of action within global world affairs at the moment. And the reason that they're taking that course of action and the reason that we find this an interesting thing to debate is probably because they have a weird set of incentives that you would not otherwise have thought of. So understanding what that actor is and how they go about thinking of the world can be particularly useful given the nature of the way CAs tend to go about creating international relations motions, what prompts them to set these types of debates. Secondly, argument generation. I want to do this by a bit of an analogy here. The system of global politics and international relations that we have in the world at the moment, it is a bit like a jigsaw puzzle. And the more pieces, therefore, you have of that puzzle, the clearer picture you have of the entire globe. But you're also then able to see how one piece connects into another piece that connects into another piece. And if you don't have that piece, then you're not able to connect onto this piece or see what's able to come next. Why is this true? Because think of the way that countries, international organizations, non-governmental bodies, and the like are all intensely intertwined with each other in the way that we work. So, for example, the US is one actor that then has a bunch of links into a bunch of different actors like NATO or the UN Security Council or the WTO, or take your pick, and then that actor has a bunch of different links into other actors and so on and so forth, and it spirals out to create this kind of large jigsaw puzzle that is the world of international politics. So understanding more individual pieces, the ways that the US thinks about a thing, and then understanding that the way that the WTO works helps you understand the way in which those two pieces fit together, the ways in which those actors might interact, and that might help you to generate some arguments that you can potentially bring forward in a debate. And lastly, optics. Yes, sometimes debating is actually about looking smart, and so knowing stuff, being able to cite actors, being able to call people out on their nonsense because you know it's not true, can be particularly important in international relations debates, particularly when I think a lot of people think this way, that this is a topic area where you should know things and maybe facts and assertions do matter slightly more in persuaded judges, and it just creates this cycle where people tend to buy into that. The reason that you actually have to know stuff and not just, assert smart things about actors that you may or may not know about is that there is a bigger risk of looking dumb in these debates because you mix up what countries border each other, or you apply one analogy to another. Like a classic one is people tend to relate a lot of kind of struggles for freedom, revolution, armed uprising, whatever you want to call it, to the troubles in Northern Ireland, the situation of Irish politics. That's just one that seems to frequently come up, particularly in the European circuit, as people want to draw analogies. And a lot of the time they end up looking really dumb because there are obviously very particular things about the context of the troubles and the history of Ireland that means that it is not a perfect analogy for a lot of other things that happen in the world. So knowing more things is important because it's good to know things, A, and B, it means that if you assert something, you're less likely to end up with egg on your face because you decided to pick the wrong and dumb thing. So that's why I think it's important to know stuff in international relations. So how do we then go about learning stuff? Well, I'm going to break this down into what types of actors, things you should try and find out, then what you should find out about those things, and then how do you go about finding out about those things. So who should you want to know about? I think there is kind of 3 core points that you want to make sure that you cover when you're looking up stuff. Firstly, obviously, the major players. These are the kind of big headline actors that are really prominent within international relations, kind of have their hands in every little bit of the pie, kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes, etc. These are your obvious actors: US, China, Russia, EU, UN, African Union, to a lesser extent some of the international organisations like the WTO, the UN Security Council, etc. These are the kind of obvious headline ones that your average informed voter probably knows that they're a major player. This shouldn't be too difficult to get your head around. Secondly then is flashpoints and current affairs. So in the run-up to a competition, in particular in the run-up to majors, i.e. Euros, Worlds, Australs, Asians, North Americans, etc., you want to look for the big conflicts that are happening currently. To take an example, when my first international, which was Athens EUDC, back in 2019, the big thing that was going on at the moment was there was the breakout of wide-scale protests in Hong Kong, and that was the point where a lot of stuff was starting to escalate with Chinese interference to a greater extent and discontent at democracy rollback in Hong Kong. So everybody was reading up on that, and lo and behold, round 2 of Athens Euros, we get a motion about Hong Kong. So CAs will tend on international relations more than most to look for what are the big things that are happening in the world at the moment, and they'll see if they can find a motion about that. And lastly, you do just want a basic handle of geography. It goes a long way. It really helps to know what countries border, I don't know, Iraq, if you're having to debate a motion about whether we regret the interventions in Iraq or not. Knowing which countries border and what actors are at play within the region kind of helps, and it looks really, really dumb if you get kind of major borders messed up between different nations. So what do you then want to know about all of these actors, shall we say, because that's essentially what we're talking about at this point? I think there's a few things. Firstly, you want to know what their interests are. That is to say, their incentives. What is it that makes this country tick? So, for example, if the actor in question is the current day Kremlin, like the Russian autocratic regime, its incentives are probably linked to a degree of Russian imperialism, and that's probably one of the core driving incentives, and also just Putin's insanity is probably an incentive at play there as well in terms of deciding actions. So what are the things that a country is aiming for, what it is interested in achieving, is kind of your big one, because that's the framework with which that actor is likely to analyse any situation in the world, and that will inform the way it makes its decision in terms of what it's going to do. Secondly, you want to know about the key stakeholders within the group, and then the pressures out the group. So what do we mean by those two? The stakeholders within are the separate individuals or sub-actors, as I'll call them, that make decisions and push stuff within that particular actor. So let's take the US as an example. There is the US, the headline actor, but then there is a whole bunch of different actors obviously at play within the US that help drive foreign policy, whether that is the national security establishment in the Pentagon and the DoD, whether that is the current executive, who's currently in the White House, then what does the state of Congress look like? What is the feeling on the ground in terms of public support for particular things? Those are the stakeholders within, the decisions that they make, that then when you put them all together end up influencing the policy that comes out at the end. So the stakeholders within an actor. Separately to that, you have the pressures without an actor, all the external forces and constraints that are being put down on an actor from outside that actor's perspective that tend to restrict its decision making. So if we get much more granular about this and we go to the specific actor that is the Biden presidency, there are particular actors without the outside of the Biden presidency that focus in on and restrain what he does or doesn't want to do. So, for example, the fact that the Republicans now, post-midterms, control the House again, and that creates a new particular set of pressures and limitations on what he as executive branch can do. That is now a pressure without, for example. What else then? Mechanisms, particularly for your international organisations like the WTO, the WHO, the UN Security Council, and others like this. It's kind of useful to know what these actors have in the toolbox, so to speak. What are the things that they can pull out and actually do stuff with? Like, if you think about international organisations, the reason that they're particularly interesting is they don't have the toolbox that most modern states do. Like the WTO can't really do sanctions. The WTO doesn't have an army that it could levy against people. It doesn't really have any particular political weight in terms of public discourse that it could do to influence people. It does, however, have other things like a bunch of rules and a bunch of lawyers and high-profile people that are connected behind the scenes that could do a bit of lobbying and other stuff. So understanding the particular toolbox that each particular has is kind of useful, because if you make the claim that, I don't know, the WTO or IMF or whatever is going to sanction something, sanction a country, you kind of end up with egg on your face, because that's not a very likely scenario, given that that is not really a tool they have in their toolbox to any degree. Ongoing actions as well. It's useful to understand what that country is involved in at the current moment. So, for example, again, if you take the US, it has its hands in a lot of places in the world right now, and it's kind of influencing a lot of things. So it's pulling strings with regards to weapons supplies to Ukraine and other support for the Ukrainian people. It has its kind of thumb on the scale in the Southeast Asian region, particularly with bolstering and quite vocal political support for Taiwan in the face of ongoing Chinese aggression, etc. All of these kind of ongoing actions have influences on the capacity constraints that the US has. So, for example, with the US supplying so much to Ukraine at the moment, how much could it realistically still have left in the tank to deploy to another conflict or hot zone if something sparked up? For example, say Putin decided to have his hand at Moldova at the same time as he's currently raging a war in Ukraine. Could the US have the spare capacity to also funnel weapons supplies into Moldova to support their plight, for example? So all these things have limitations, but also give you an insight into the ways in which an actor has acted in the past and acting currently, and that might help you predict what an actor might be likely or more likely to do in a way that you can analyse on a particular motion that you're debating. Additionally, what alternative actions do they have? So if that's the current courses of actions that they're doing, it's maybe useful to know what other courses of actions countries might have had versus the action that they ended up taking in the end. Did a country rush into a conflict when it maybe could have applied a little bit more political pressure or sanctions, for example? Oftentimes you'll find that the actor came to the only realistic decision it could in the end, but it's kind of useful to know what other stuff was being discussed at the time. Why did they or did they not rule in or rule out certain actions? And then you obviously just want to know a lot of other kind of general characteristics of countries, things that are useful to know. Population size, strength of economy, nature of the economy is kind of useful, what kind of industries are important here. For example, with regards to Taiwan, it's particularly important to know that they have a strong grasp of the international market in semiconductors that creates a lot of influence in a very specific way. So those kind of more general, granular characteristics that don't really fit in elsewhere here. So those are the actors you want to look at. Those are what you want to know about those actors. So how do you then go about finding information? It's this magical device that most of us have in our pockets, called the internet. Yeah, all of this information is very easily findable online. But where online should you go that's particularly useful? So in terms of sources for actually researching information straight up, the Council on Foreign Relations is the big one that I advocate for here. It is a very good site, generally non-biased, but does quite a lot of good breakdowns of the major affairs. What I would particularly recommend is if you go to the Council on Foreign Relations website, they have a daily newsletter called the Daily Briefing that they email out to you at the same time every weekday, and that is a very good, just quick 5-minute overview of everything that's happening in the various regions of the world at that particular day, just to give you a breakdown. And once you get that and you start to read that in your email inbox every day for 5 minutes, you start to pick up on the patterns of what topics are coming up again and again and again. And oh, maybe I should actually then look more deeply into this particular thing because it's coming up again and again and again. So the Council on Foreign Relations is a big one I advocate for. BBC News World section, pretty good in terms of the non-biased reporting, but also kind of quite good on-the-ground reporting as well as what the BBC tends to do in a lot of conflicts and hotspots around the world. That is particularly useful. Vice, particularly a lot of the videos that they put out on YouTube, kind of 10 minutes explainers, 10-minute clips on YouTube, very useful if you're making dinner and you've got a half an hour while you're making dinner. Just put 3 of them on in the background on, I don't know, nuclear weapons in the US or Russia or whatever. I don't know. They have a bunch of good videos there. They're pretty useful. Lastly, classic debater one, The Economist, always has good breakdowns. Watch out for some of the biases that it has, but generally speaking, very good, particularly on international relations, slightly less biased than it is in some of its economic stuff. Additionally, and this is one I've newly added to this workshop, some quizzes and games are also another useful resource. In particular here, what I'm thinking of is what I said earlier about it kind of helps to have a useful handle on geography and just knowing the world to be able to name drop stuff. Sporkle is an entirely quiz website. It's got nothing to do with international relations or research or information or anything like that. But what it does have is a lot of quite well put together quizzes on like the countries of the world, like just going through them and can you name all the countries of the world? Can you name all the capitals of Europe? Can you place the countries of Africa without any of the borders drawn in? It's kind of useful for forcing your brain in a kind of gamified way to get a handle on this type of stuff, so that you can just quickly name drop particular countries and particular capitals at the drop of a hat. Okay. That's all you want to kind of learn. But how can you then analyze these debates? What are the ways to look at international relations debates? And for any of you who have maybe done a kind of entry-level course at university on international relations, this will sound a little familiar, but bringing this stuff out of its academic language helps you see how it might actually be useful in debates. So this is kind of talking about the first principles of international relations. So the first one here is kind of power versus cooperation. So if you have done international relations courses and you want the academic language here, we're talking about your kind of realist perspectives on international relations versus your liberal perspectives on international relations. Broadly, the power versus cooperation one boils down to does an actor value being aggressive, having a lot of hard power, i.e. military might, economic might that it can then use to leverage over other countries, kind of hard power mechanisms, and sees the world as a zero-sum game where their security is traded off against other securities and we don't really gain from working with each other? Or do actors tend to look at the world in a kind of more liberal, cooperative sense, where they tend to be much more diplomatic? They see international relations as positive sum, that is to say, by the strength of us economically cooperating and integrating with each other, we become more secure on the whole. We become less likely to go to conflict on the whole. The world has been through its peaks and troughs of realism and liberalism in terms of the dominant sphere of thought within international relations, but kind of those are the two kind of core ones that always get wrestled with. Why does this matter as a lens for looking at international relations debates? It matters because it tells you a lot about the optionality that actors have. That is to say, if an actor tends to look at the world through hard power mechanisms, or it has at its disposal a lot of hard power mechanisms, then it might be more likely to opt for a hard power mechanism that it doesn't when it doesn't necessarily have the option to cooperate. Similarly, if they don't have hard power mechanisms, they might be forced to cooperate in order to secure their safety. A classic example of that might be, again, let's just take something that is kind of in the news at the moment, Moldova. Moldova has a pretty crappy military. By all standards, it's pretty non-existent. So the way that it has tried to guarantee its security is by being peaceful and trying to cooperate both with the Europeans, the European Union, and the Russians to a lesser extent, depending on who's in government at what time, what the particular political mood is. Polarity. So is the world unipolar, bipolar, or multipolar? So this is the world's centers of power, its spheres of influence. These are the kind of major actors that draw other actors to it because other smaller actors think that aligning by with that big actor or working with that big actor, they will get some positive benefit, whether that is security, favorable trade relations, or just not being invaded. The world has been through peaks and troughs here. So during the Cold War, the world was solidly bipolar. You had the capitalist West with the US at the center, and then the kind of more communist East. With the USSR at its center. When the USSR collapsed, we went through the unipolar moment where the US was the really only major global power left for 20 years or so. Now that's starting to shift again as we see the rise of China to create another kind of sphere of influence, a kind of point of power within the globe. Why does this matter? A lot of debates, if you look at previous motions on international relations, tend to focus on this. So, for example, this is a bad example in modern context, but this motion was quite common a number of years ago and demonstrates this. This House believes that the Russians should pivot towards China rather than towards the West, or vice versa. It was more set as towards the West rather than towards China. What that motion is driving at is, does it make more sense for the Russians to swing towards friendly relations with one centre of the world or another centre of the world? What can they gain from the relative centres of the world? Obviously, that motion no longer makes any sense because of the actions that the dictator and the Kremlin has taken. But it kind of demonstrates the point. So a lot of debates do kind of focus on that to a lesser extent. And the other thing here is a lot of actors do just have to figure this into their mindset. Like if you are Moldova, if you are other smaller states within various parts of the world, you do kind of have to factor in, who am I aligned with? Who am I going to get the next big trade deal with? Who's going to come to my aid if I have a humanitarian crisis? Who's going to come to my aid if I am threatened militarily, etc. This just is something that they have to think on in their mindsets because they can't survive on their own. None of us can. No country is totally self-reliant, except maybe the North Koreans, and even then it's not really a great example, is it? Lastly here is ways to look at international relations debates. So the self-interest or the general interest, which is, are the actors focused on themselves or are they focused on the general interest? So, for example, historically, if you look here, the European Union and the US have kind of had not diametrically opposed, but somewhat divergent takes on foreign aid and humanitarian aid. the US historically has used it as a way to exert power and influence. It has quite often provided or not provided humanitarian aid, for that matter, for political reasons. Indeed, I think it's still true to say that its international development budgets and decisions are still integrated within its kind of foreign office. I forget what the equivalent, the State Department, that's the one. So political calculations fully figure into their decision making. The same is not true in a lot of European states and the EU itself. The EU has historically actually been quite good at just providing humanitarian aid and foreign aid for its own sake without attaching political conditions like imposing particular economic regimes or advancing human rights, yada, yada, yada. You could make the claim that that might be good or bad, but that is to say, not all actors in IR debates are entirely self-interest. At the same time, none of them are entirely focused on the general interest as well. So this goes back to the kind of, you want to learn about the incentives of an actor. When you're learning about the incentives of an actor, it's useful to bear in mind, okay, an actor is thinking in this particular direction or in that particular direction, they have this particular interest. Is that a form of self-interest or general interest? That's particularly useful in IR debates, which are done from a specific actor motion perspective. So this house, as the actor, would do the thing. Knowing whether they actually care about the general or the self-interest is useful for characterizing that actor, obviously. So, metrics. Once you kind of know stuff and you you have these different lenses with which to analyze international relations, what wins you an international relations debate? So I think there's a bunch of different metrics for winning in these debates. Firstly, more dead people or more lives saved. Full disclosure, I hate this metric in debating. I think this is a really dumb and lazy way to do debating. Not every motion comes down to people will die as a result of doing this motion or not doing this motion. It's true on some motions, but I think a lot of people have, for a long time in debating, been quite lazy and been like, well, the only way we understand impacts is dead people or not, because that's what we can all agree on as a bad thing. I just think it's quite dumb. International relations is the exception to the rule, because in IR debates, there is quite a high likelihood that some of the decisions taken will result in dead people, particularly if you're discussing intervention or not, if you're discussing a sanctions regime or a trade war or not. Those are done at such a macro level with such hard power mechanisms that they obviously can be boiled down to quite real effects in terms of lives on the ground or not. So even in non-conflict scenarios, in international relations, more dead people can be done and is kind of an easy way to go about it. That being said, be aware of the actors at play. The thought experiment here I haven't updated since Russia-Ukraine, and you can probably tell because it's a bit sensitive. But think about it. If you have an actor debate where the actor is this house as the Kremlin or this house as Russia, for example, the Kremlin might care about dead people, but the dead people it cares about is not having any of the oligarchs or the insiders die. Probably doesn't care that much about whether Americans or others die or not. Maybe Americans to a slight degree if they want to avoid World War III. But you kind of get the gist, right? Like, you have to be careful about just being like, well, I can prove more people die on this motion, therefore I have a strong impact to the debate. Make sure that the person who's actually dying is is somebody that that actor that is in question might actually care about whether that happens or not to tell you stuff about the likelihood of the impact. Most importantly here for other stuff is explain your impacts. So international relations debates outside of the more people are dead, more lives saved argument is probably the only other type of debate that comes close to this is debates about social movements. Are the most likely to end up in buzzword impacts. So if you think about social movement debates, they tend to end up in buzzword impacts like representation and stuff. And people are pretty bad at explaining what representation is and why it matters and getting a judge to care about that impact because they assume it should be intuitive and it should be understood. That's not how debating works. International relations is also like that, and I think a lot of people can end up at buzzwords of there will be sanctions, or there will be a trade war, or there will be tensions in the region, or a propensity for conflict, as I've got on the slide here. What does that mean? I like genuinely. What do tensions mean? What does it mean for someone living on the ground in a country, for their country to be at higher tensions with China, for example? What are the day-to-day impacts on their lives? How much more likely is this making conflict? How bad would that be, etc.? Make sure to ground your impacts and explain them into the real world, and actually try to prove a marginality here. So the top impact that you could go for here, the easy one, it's pretty self-explanatory. All the other ones, make sure you ground it in the reality of what is going on the ground. So if we then move on then to break down actors, because I think it's quite easy to group the actors here, and ways you can go about discussing the different actors that exist within international relations debates. Firstly, you have your governments or states. These are the core of international relations. The entire global order is founded on a basic principle of national sovereignty. Of each country has their own state, and we respect the sovereignty of each other's territory. Sometimes that breaks down. Some people get good big ideas where they can just violate each other's sovereignty. But generally speaking, international relations is the relations between nations. So understanding governments and states and the way that they tend to look is kind of particularly useful for understanding then the way that international relations is likely to work. So what should you go about understanding with regards to governments or states? Firstly, they require certain things in order to be able to function. So they tend to require a degree of domestic support. That is to say, any state requires the support of its population in order to not get overthrown or not get revolutioned. This is even true of autocratic regimes, like the Chinese state. The North Koreans do have to do at least some appeasement and giving basic stuff or propagandizing their populations in order to continue getting the support that they need in order to do stuff from their population. Similarly, each state will need military support, otherwise they get coup d'etat by their military and by people who think they are powerful and have an army, so could do stuff with it. A lot of states will also require the backing of oligarchs, key businessmen who prop up political systems, etc. This is particularly true of certain actors like Russia and others to a lesser degree. And then they also require international backing, that is to say, allies, people to trade with, etc., and money to do things, to buy guns and do trade wars and other things like this. Where did they get that support from? They will tend to get it from, for economic reasons, they will get support for cultural, ideological, historical regions, etc. This is where you want to start thinking about specnology stuff. So if you get your support from all of these things, domestic support, military support, what causes them to support that? They tend to, people will support it for nationalist reasons. So for example, the reason that Xi Jinping and a lot of Chinese support greater intervention into Taiwan is because of nationalist narratives, is because of ideology and history and culture there. So understanding the cause of that support helps you understand how other actors would have to interact with actors on the ground and what they're interested in order to influence that support in particular directions. So understanding what causes particular actors that support governments and states to act is where you need the most specky knowledge because it's the most granular part of the argument to some degree. And the other thing that is useful to know about for governments and states is what are the mechanisms for internal change, policy directionality. So if you know where governments and states get their support from and why those particular actors support them, what are the mechanisms for change that those actors have to exert upon that state? So that could be as simple as factions within the ruling party, opposition movements, business interests, military power, and then you can get into kind of weird and wacky stuff around cultural cleavage realignments in terms of the way that politics tends to break down within that country, or not. So the other actor that I think is useful to note that comes up again and again in IR debates outside of states is the other set group that are kind of core to the functioning of international relations is international organizations. These ones are a little bit trickier. The reason they're also fundamental is because if international relations is the relations between nations, international organizations are the bodies which bring all these countries together, get them at the table, get them talking, etc. Outside of just kind of your normal bilateral meetings, etc. Why is this a little trickier? Because there's lots of them and they all function in a different way. So as I've got down here, the European Union is not the same and does not operate the same and doesn't have the same mechanisms that the UN does. It does not have the same as the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, nor is it the same to the African Union, nor is it the same to the Eurasian Economic Union or the WTO, etc., etc. All of these international organizations are slightly different in various ways, which makes it really hard to do a workshop on without going into mega detail on all of the core ones to explain all of the little differences that they have. So this is one that you actually do have to research, which is why I kind of flagged it earlier in the learning stuff one as one you actually have to go away and read about, because it's often not intuitive to the same degree. But what are the key things to look out for here? So look for the core in actors and power imbalances. So if you take the WTO, for example, the World Trade Organization, the US holds a disproportionate amount of voting power in the WTO when it comes to deciding particular trade policy, regulations, etc. Similarly, China has a lot of sway there, but there's a big power imbalance there where China feels shut out to some degree. At the same time, China violates a lot of WTO agreements and gets a lot of lawsuits lodged against it within the WTO. So look out for the core actors within groups. Another example here, or two more examples actually, just for the sake of kind of depth of this explanation. Who are the core actors within the EU? Historically, probably Germany and France. With the war in Ukraine and everything that's happening in the East, that pole might be shifting eastwards towards Poland. So you and other Eastern European states. So you might want to think more about those power imbalances and how power imbalances shift, or how they don't shift. The UN Security Council, where we have 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the Americans, the Brits, Chinese, French, and Russians, and these don't change and all have veto power in a way that a bunch of other countries in the world don't, mostly because they all won World War II. Those are the kind of core actors. The other thing you want to look out for is the purpose. So all of these things have particularly different stated aims, and that will help you understand the mechanisms that come down the line. So for example, the purpose of NATO is collective self-defense of the democratic states of the Western world, of Europe and North America. Hence, it's the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Its sole purpose, therefore, is a military alliance and a self-defense military alliance, which means that it doesn't really do discussions about trade ever, because it's just not in its remit. It's not what it's for. Those discussions happen elsewhere, in the EU, in transatlantic partnerships, etc. So look out for the particular purpose of each of the organizations, which might not always be obvious. Some of them are quite broad, some of them take in different things, some of them are hyper-specific, some of them it is obvious. It's pretty blooming obvious what the World Health Organization is for example. And lastly then, mechanisms. It's useful to understand what all of these bodies can do. So again, EU has the ability to legislate, has the ability to reallocate funds within its member states, has the ability to negotiate and implement trade deals, and all that kind of good fun stuff. Other actors don't necessarily have the same degree of mechanisms. They can release statements, they could hold meetings, etc., but they don't really have a lot of power. So look out for those things within international organizations. Who are the core actors within them? And if you don't know anything else about the international organization, you can then just boil it right back down to this is the core actor within this international organization because this is what we know about this core actor. Therefore, this core actor is likely to coerce the international organization to act in this particular way. And you can circumvent having to know a lot of stuff. Or you can do the research properly and also find out purpose and mechanism. I've used the word mechanism a lot in this workshop for thinking about how international actors go about conducting different things. So what do I actually mean? What are the mechanisms for conducting international relations? I think there are 4 categories here. Military action. So these are your peacekeeping missions, these are your invasions, these are your boots on the ground, etc. Pretty explanatory. There is your direct support. So this is just short of military intervention, but still kind of within the sphere of a military action-ish, so to speak. So this is your arms supplying, basically everything, intelligence sharing, everything that the West is doing right now to support Ukraine, short of actively getting involved in the war. That's the kind of thing I mean by direct support. Diplomacy, political pressure, bribes in some instances, sanctions, etc. All of these things that are used in order to kind of coerce and wrangle, or not even that nefariously, just convince other nations to work with you and keep dialogue up to avoid miscalculations or to get particular actors aligned to do certain things. And lastly, economics is a big tool of international relations, and so I would advocate going away and understanding more about how economics works as well. So these are your things like trade deals, international inclusion and international in agreements, active participation in international organizations like the EU or the WTO, ones that are explicitly set up for the purpose of economic development. So, what I want to do now is break down much more specifically 2 aspects of debating that I think are done poorly within international relations. That is sanctions, and then I'm going to talk about intervention. For the next 2 slides, I want to shout out credit to Andrew Moore of Monash Debating, who did this breakdown in an online workshop they did. I think it's really good and a really granular examination of what you want to be doing with analysis debates, which is why I now have integrated it as part of workshops that I give on international relations. But all credit should go to Andrew for doing this first. So, sanctions. People are crap at talking about sanctions because not a lot of people go down into the granular analysis of when sanctions are likely to be efficacious or not, and that matters because it's really easy for a side to stand up and say sanctions aren't really that efficacious, so why should we care about them as an impact, for example? Or people will drill down into sanctions are bad because they hurt ordinary people on the ground, without actually explaining how sanctions work to get there. These are the granular ways you can go about proving whether sanctions are a success or not. So there's 5 questions you can ask. Firstly, who's doing the sanction? So if we take a case study which is apartheid South Africa, where there were sanctions placed on South Africa in order to try to cajole it into ending the apartheid regime, and that was done relatively successfully. It took a while, but the sanctions did eventually have the desired effect. Part of the reason that was successful was that the people doing the sanctions were allies. That in the form of other African states, other members of the Commonwealth who used to have quite strong historical relations to South Africa and the apartheid regime there. The reason why it's kind of successful if allies do sanctions is, one, because they're not expected. That is to say, you can have a real kind of signalling shock effect on a nation that makes it rethink if an ally all of a sudden turns around and puts sanctions on. Secondly, they're not able to prepare themselves for it. That is to say, they're not able to wean themselves off of the reliance that they have with their allies in order to guard themselves against the negative shocks of the sanctions being put in place. The converse of this is sanctions tend to fail when it's really just your opponents that do them. So an example, the case study here is North Korea and weapons of mass destruction, where the North Koreans have been able to develop ICBMs and nuclear warheads, despite our best efforts to sanction that regime in North Korea. The reason that didn't really work is because the US and a lot of the Western world put sanctions on, but we never really had strong economic relations with the North Koreans in the first place. Therefore, it didn't really have that much of a major effect on the economy. They were able to use it as a rallying point against the West, say, look at them, they're being evil, sanctioning us, hurting our people, etc. And so it all kind of starts to backfire. What the domestic situation on the ground is also important. So in apartheid South Africa, there was an opposition to apartheid, obviously. So if you are able to line up your sanctions regime in support of that opposition, whilst targeting the regime or whoever it is you want to target with your sanctions, that provides a greater impetus and a kind of reinforcing effect for the opposition that might exist on the ground in wherever it is you're sanctioning. The inverse was not true in North Korea. There was no opposition because that regime is a unified ideological state that is heavily propagandized, where information is sanitized, etc., which means that there was no opposition group which our sanctions could have a kind of positive morale-inducing effect upon. What is the structure of the economy? So it was successful in apartheid South Africa because no private business wants to be sanctioned, obviously, because it hurts their ability to do international trade and all other business. If an economy is largely privatized and there's a lot of private business, in this globalized world we live in, they can take their business elsewhere, which then creates a doubling effect on these sanctions. Because it's not just the direct effect of the sanctions now, but you're also harming an economy through indirect effects. As I mentioned earlier, economies and private business are kind of core actors that prop up a state, whether that is through lobbying or political donations, or just keeping an economy functioning full stop. So if they flee elsewhere because they fear violating a sanctions package, that's going to harm you quite a lot. In the case of North Korea, that wasn't true because the thing is mostly state-controlled. It didn't really matter that we sanctioned these state businesses. They had nowhere to flee, so they were already going to double down internally. What do the sanctions look like? Are they comprehensive or are there backdoors? So the sanctions regime we had in South Africa was pretty good insofar as there wasn't really kind of major escape routes to get around them for the powerful people. The same is not true in North Korea, where there are kind of backdoors to the sanctions that allow the North Korean regime to get kind of specialty items in through the door. This is why sanctions packages get updated so often with new stuff added to them. It's not just because we want to provide regimes with an out, or as a stick to say there's more that we can do, but also just because there's things that we don't either see or regimes come up with new mechanisms to circumvent a sanctions package. And lastly, who's hit by the sanctions? So South Africa was useful because it kind of hit everyone, which is one of the core reasons that a lot of debaters and people in the world will tend to use to say, this is why sanctions are bad, because they hurt ordinary people. It sounds hard to say, but it kind of has to at the end of the day. If it doesn't hurt everyone, and some people are able to get through, particularly powerful elites, then you are unlikely to get the political change that you need. Case in point, North Korea, where the North Koreans have a backdoor and a powerful elite that, because it controls the economy, and it has a powerful ally in China that is willing to support the elites within that regime, it doesn't actually hit the people in the decision-making circles that might pressure Kim Jong-un or someone else in order to change policy in certain ways. Whereas if you hit everyone, then that means that everybody is now starting to talk about, okay, how I don't have an escape route here. I am actually being directly affected. I need to put pressure on my government. I need to do something in order to try and get these sanctions lifted. So this is the kind of case for how, this is the kind of granular thing you can do to prove that a sanctions package is likely to be effective or not effective at a more granular level. Lastly, intervention. Walk through a similar thing here. I think is kind of interesting. Like sanctions, I think these are also often very poorly discussed things within debating, because a lot of people just seem to assume that military intervention is bad, particularly if it's the US doing it, given the history of Iraq, etc., which, like, fair, very fair. But sometimes military intervention is actually useful and can be done in a way that is successful. So the two case studies we're going for here is Kosovo, so the crisis in the former Yugoslavia through the 90s and early 2000s, and the failure case study here is going to be the 2003 invasion of Iraq, not to be confused with the first Gulf War in the early 90s, which was actually a resounding success and a pretty good military intervention. What are the kind of ways you can break down military intervention as to whether they will work? Firstly, is the international community divided or not? The part of the reason why the intervention to stop, the genocides and other things within the Balkans was successful is because there broadly was no opponents. And when I say opponents here, I am mostly talking about both your major actors, but also your regional players. So the Russians and the Chinese were broadly not opposed. They were somewhat annoyed. The Chinese, there was a particular incident with the Chinese when a rogue NATO missile hit their embassy in one of the Balkan states. I forget which one. I think it might have been Belgrade. But by and large, China and Russia didn't really have the power to do anything, particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So they weren't really opposed to that intervention, which means that there was nobody funneling resources into the kind of on-the-ground forces opposing the intervention to some degree. But also it had the widespread support of local actors. Like, Europe was pretty united on intervention in Kosovo once all of the diplomatic options had kind of been exhausted. The same is not true of Iraq in 2003. Pretty obviously, the Russians were opposed to that. The Chinese were also to some extent opposed. But more importantly, the US couldn't even convince all of its main allies to back the invasion of Iraq in 2003. France, Germany, both very, very hesitant about that, which means if you have fractured support, it means you look like you have a bad case for the intervention, but you also don't have more people bringing their assets down in order to make sure that the intervention is successful. It also means you're less likely to take major risks because you're more likely to be hung out to dry. To take a different example, that is part of the reason why Obama didn't enforce the red line on chemical weapons usage in Syria in 2014 because the UK decided, we're not going to back you on this one. He was left with France as the only ally, and Obama decided that wasn't enough to take action in Syria at that point in time. Domestic support. So in the country that is doing the intervention, so in principally Western NATO states in the Kosovo example, similarly the US and others in Iraq in 2003. In Kosovo, in the example of Kosovo and the Balkans, there was substantial support within the West for doing something. We had seen the horrors of the breakup of Yugoslavia. We had seen the images of the genocide coming out of there. So there was support to do something. Similarly, there were also selfish reasons at play. The fears of spillover conflict within the region, within Europe, just also prodded NATO to act to a large degree. So there was pretty unified support on that one. A similar one, if you don't like the Kosovo example, would be the Gulf War in the early 90s, where everybody was kind of agreed that it was wrong of Saddam Hussein to just invade Kuwait and start torturing and doing horrible things in order to gain Kuwait's oil fields. There was no... everybody was kind of domestically behind, we need to go for that. Even with hesitancy after Vietnam in the US, there was broad support for that in the end. The same is not true of the invasion in Iraq in 2003. There were large-scale protests. The biggest ever protests held in the UK were on the invasion of Iraq in 2003. When you don't have that domestic support, it's difficult to kind of keep a cohesive force, keep people's minds on following through an intervention to the end, which leads me on to the duration of the intervention. Our intervention in Kosovo and in the Balkans is technically ongoing. There's not active conflict there, but despite the fact that active intervention in the bombing of Belgrade and other places was in the late 90s, we still have NATO peacekeeping and EU policing missions present within the various parts of the Balkans to keep the peace. The same is true in a whole bunch of other parts of the world where there is peace. Cyprus, for example, the UK base that is there, plus UN peacekeepers, prevent Greek Cypriots and Turk Cypriots from having it out with each other over Cyprus. Similarly, the US presence within South Korea is a major deterrent to the North having any taking any actions against South Korea. So, whilst a lot of people tend to get fatigued of interventions, one of the core things that makes an intervention successful is your ability to see it out to the bitter end. That's where we kind of failed with Iraq in 2003, and that the war was won within a month. But then we weren't, after that, a lot of what the US focused on was more about how do we get the troops out, how do we just stabilise this and move on to or some degree. There was a degree of nation building there, which I'll discuss in a minute. But broadly speaking, we were into Iraq in 2003, and the real drawdown of troops started to happen in about 2011-ish. So we're only there a decade, which wasn't enough to maintain the peace. Fast forward a couple of years, you get ISIS and others rising up within that region and just a whole collapse. It actually does matter that you keep peace there. Another good example would be Afghanistan. Afghanistan was actually relatively peaceful after the surge in 2011. Obviously, still a lot of fighting, lots of bad things happening, unquestionably. But things had broadly begun to settle down from the peak of the conflict of Afghanistan. And then we withdrew, and it all went to hell in a handbasket with the Taliban moving back into Kabul in late 2021. It's also important with interventions to analyse what the on-the-ground situation is. So in the Kosovo and Balkan example, the West kind of took some efforts to win hearts and minds of a lot of the people on the ground. Not everyone, obviously, a lot of people were unhappy with the NATO intervention, still are for various reasons, but they did try to find a way to actually make the on-the-ground situation work by accommodating the various problems. So that looked like providing justice for people who need it. So we put the perpetrators of some of the kind of major war crimes against minorities in the Balkans on trial in The Hague to provide justice for those people. There was political accommodation, and a lot of states see the way in which Kosovo is kind of has kind of three main groups that all kind of need to agree to stuff. There were various accommodations made in order to make stuff work and to stabilize the region and accommodate all the different actors that were within it. Whether those efforts are successful or not, the long arc of history will tell us. But the efforts were, broadly speaking, made. The same was not true of Iraq in 2003. We did try to do some degree of nation building, but it was bad nation building, where we tended to pit one ethnic group against the other, prioritize one sect of Islam over another sect of Islam, and we just weren't accommodating all the nuances and cultural things on the ground. That meant that when we tried to set up a form of government, it was never going to work because it just wasn't relevant to the people on the ground. So it's important to understand what comes after the conflict and how much is understood, how much effort is put in on the ground in order to making that work. And speaking of effort on the ground, the last thing to talk about here, which is the level of force. There was a wide-ranging force in Kosovo, not just in the amount of military assets, but also in that there were programs of rebuilding that came sweeping in. Similarly, part of the way in which we resolved and did political accommodations and tried to present a new vision for the Balkans afterwards was the EU came along and said, hey, we'll give you a path to EU membership. Eventually you'll integrate with us, and this is the positive path you can have as the Balkans moving forward. Now, EU has been kind of crappy in terms of following through on that, particularly in recent years. But we kind of brought to bear all different assets, not just military, on that. The same was not true in Iraq. We did not bring to bear all of the kind of nation building, infrastructure building stuff that we probably should have. Certainly not to the degree we should have. Some of it was there, but not as much. But also just going back to what I said about the US kind of tried to see this as a get in, get out, meant that they weren't prepared for the amount of force that was going to be necessary in the long run to do the security job of the Iraqi army and the Iraqi police services that they had just destroyed in the conflict. So they were then non-committal about providing security and other mechanisms, and they had deployed the right types of forces in order to do that, because they had to take into consideration, which meant that there wasn't the force and the diversity of force necessary there in order to make that intervention a success in the long run. That pretty much covers everything I wanted to say in this workshop. I hope that's kind of been useful as an insight into what you should learn, different ways to analyse actors and look at international relations debates, and then hopefully, if nothing else, you've seen ways in which you can go about analysing interventions and sanctions, which will hopefully strengthen your arguments on them. If you have any questions about anything I've discussed in this workshop, please feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on Facebook, just type in Alexander Fraser, and I should probably pop up. If we are floating about in debating circles together, I'll probably come up with a bunch of mutuals. Feel free to drop me a message about anything. Thank you, everybody.